Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Athanasios Nenis, and I'll be moderating the seminar today. Everybody has joined to the Climate seminar series. Today's the third episode. And just some information which everybody knows by now, but it's always good to revisit. This is the seminar series of the Climate Center, which is the joint EPFL UNIL interdisciplinary center aiming to highlight climate research and raise ambition on climate action. The seminar series, How to Move Forward and Act on Climate Change, is an interactive online event that happens twice every month, every second Monday, with 2 speakers. And the objective is to bring the communities of UNIL and EPFL together and engage in dialogue with scientists, with politicians, entrepreneurs, and actors from the civil society through collective reflection. Today we have 2 seminar speakers. The first one is Ian Delaney, who's a lecturer at the Institute of Earth System Dynamics at UNIL, and he will talk about understanding a changing landscape and insights from a long boat trip in the Arctic. The second speaker is Esther Breuninger, who's a PhD student in Inorganic Environmental Geochemistry at ETH Zürich and Eawag, and she will talk about trace element cycling in the atmosphere. Just some comments. These seminars will last about 20 minutes, and then there will be a discussion phase of around 10 minutes. And everybody's asked to keep their microphones and videos off unless if you're speaking. Of course, we have a no harassment policy. If someone is bothering you, please let us know so they can be removed from the meeting. The seminars are recorded and will be posted online. And if you want to ask questions, please write them in the chat or raise your hand. And of course, it's bilingual, so questions and discussion in both English and French are totally acceptable. And with that, I'd like to ask for the seminar speakers to start, starting first with Ian. Ian, whenever you're ready.
Hello, can everyone see my screen and hear me?
Absolutely, perfect.
Excellent. Well, thank you. It's really nice to be here, and it's really nice to talk about what I do. And what I would like to discuss today is some work I'm doing on trying to understand how glacier erosion and landforms may change in the Arctic as the climate warms and as glaciers retreat. And in particular, I want to talk about some work I did this summer in the Russian Arctic. This is work I've done with Brahim Salma Bomu and Frederick Hermann at the University of Lausanne. And then also the expedition that I'm going to talk about was in collaboration with people such as GeoMar, Swiss Polar Institute, the Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute in St. Petersburg. It was part of this Arctic Century expedition. So I presume most people here have seen a photo like this. The left photo is Swift Glacier in 2004. And the right photo is Swift Glacier in 2014. And the most obvious thing is there's a lot less ice. There's been an increased amount of melt, and this ice is disappearing. And this is something that we talk about a lot here in Switzerland. But there's something else about this process that is interesting to me, and that is the downstream change and the landscape change that accompanies this. And these are 2 photos of Tahoma Creek, which is a small drainage radiating from Mount Rainier, which is a glaciated volcano in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And the photo on the left was taken by a professor of mine when I was an undergraduate. It's from 1988, which is the year I was born. I think this photo may have even been taken a month or 2 after I was born. And the photo on the right is from myself, from the exact same location, 21 years later, when I was a bachelor student doing kind of my first research experience. And we can see how much this has changed. We can see how the bottom of this river has just greatly widened. We can see how these slopes have changed, how the vegetation has changed. So this is really my first interaction of how these glaciers interact with the landscape on a fairly short time scale. This is 21 years. And this is something that's happening in the Alps as well. Some work here about Lac Léman has looked at the deposition rates of sediment into Lac Léman and noticed how over time the ways that this deposition occurs changes as a result of the influx of sediment into the lake. For instance, here's another study looking at the amount of suspended sediment. So the sediment that somehow makes the water brown or dark, and how this has changed through time, and how there's been quite a substantial increase in suspended sediment leaving the Rhone Valley and entering Lac Léman. And in part, this is coming from places like this. This is Glacier Glacier at the end of the Rhone Valley. And it's in spring, so it's hard to tell exactly where the glacier is, but it comes down kind of through the middle of the photo. And we can see the amount of sediment that has been deposited in this reservoir since it has been built. So this reservoir was drained this year for some maintenance work, and we can see this fine grained sediment that's been deposited. So things are changing with our landscape. So we've done a fair bit of work in the Alps, but in my opinion, there's some really big questions about how glacier erosion is working in the Arctic and what this means for sediment supply and fluvial processes in these regions. And in fact, on this slide, I've posted most of the information that I could find about glacier erosion in the Greenland ice sheet. So on the left, we have a map of the Greenland ice sheet. And these small dots, don't worry about them too much, but there are some kind of remotely sensed metrics of how much sediment is in the water. We notice that there's some variable erosion rates. So a millimeter per year is kind of what we expect here in the Alps. So this is the height change in a glacier ice or a height change in a catchment over 1 year. So these are somewhat comparable to what we see in the Alps, but we don't really have enough to know if this is a time transgressive process, or if this is changing, or if it's spatial heterogeneity. Also in Greenland, it's been documented that the large proglacial deltas have been forming off the west coast of Greenland since the 1980s. And this is corresponded with increased melt from the Greenland ice sheet. So processes are changing here as well. But we still don't know very much about these processes. There's been some work looking at glacier erosion here in Svalbard, but we really don't know what is happening in Franz Josef Land or Savina Semlia. And this map is a little bit old, but the colors actually represent changes in glacier thickness in the region. And so we can see that in some spots, actually, there's been a fair bit of glacier thinning on the order of 0.5 meter per year, which is quite substantial. So we have reason to believe that things could be changing here. And this is important. You know, in the Arctic is warming at a rate that's faster than much of the rest of the world. We can see this here, where we have a surface air temperature trend, and we really see this pit of the Arctic is warming quite quickly. And this has implications for lots of things. For instance, you know, these people were interested in sea ice extent, and here we have a plot of sea ice extent, and from the 1970s to the 1990s. It's covered in September in sea ice, and by the end of this century, there's almost no sea ice in September. And this means there's changes in shipping. For instance, shipping from Europe to Asia can now go over the pole. There's changes in oil and gas exploration, there's changes in fisheries. But scientifically, I think there's a big reason to study this area that's changing so quickly. And specifically for me, this erosion can impact ocean ecosystems. And there's also much to be learned about the ways that this sediment and the ocean and the glacier all act together to somehow determine the dynamics of these glaciers in the Arctic, how they move, how they melt. And so very little is known. So we're asking the questions: what changes have occurred to the landscape, and what can this tell us about how these changes what changes may we face in the future? So we intend to use the knowledge that we've accumulated here on mountain glaciers from places like Switzerland and apply them to glaciers in the Arctic. So for instance, here on the right, we have Gorner Glacier. And this is a photo taken from Gornergrat. And we can see the glacier coming down is quite steep. There's lots of crevasses. There's lots of sediment around, lots of old moraines. And then here we have a glacier at Franz Josef Land that we visited during this cruise. And we can see that it's somehow a bit different. It's quite shallow. Maybe it behaves something like a drop of honey that maybe you spill on your table and kind of deforms. But we believe that some of the underlying mechanisms and processes will be similar to what we see here in Switzerland. And in this way, we can start to understand what kind of glacier erosion processes are happening in Franz Josef Land and Savannah Summit. And there's a good basis for this. So here are some glacier velocities. We can see the glacier velocities in white here, and the glaciers are in black. And we can see that some of the glaciers are moving a pretty decent amount. I believe the scale on this is something like 100 meters per year. And we know that once glaciers start moving at these speeds, they start to really slide on their beds and grind the bedrock below them, so they can erode. And so there's definitely not this process going on everywhere, but it's pronounced. It's present. We see it here, and we see it here. We see it a little bit here. This is actually a surging glacier that's been something very exciting for the community. So the opportunity came to study these places this last summer during the Arctic Century expedition to the Russian Arctic. So this was, I believe there's around 55 scientists on board, and we left Murmansk in the beginning of August. We sailed north to Novaya Zemlya, and then we started our pathway around the Arctic. And this was a really just absolutely fascinating expedition. There's oceanographers, people studying the atmosphere. I was part of a marine geology group asking questions about kind of what the the older conditions of the ocean and was in this area, in addition to work about erosion potentially. And then also there's people studying the terrestrial nature of these islands, what kind of plants are existing here. So really great opportunity. And so what we tried to do is collect sediment cores from in front of glaciers. And the idea here is that we have a Arctic ice cap, something like this. It will erode its bedrock, and the sediment below will be carried into the fjord or into the area in front of the glacier and deposited there. And if we take a sediment core, we can start to look at the different layers and understand the distances between layers and start to kind of postulate about whether this is a increase in erosion or a decrease in erosion. And so to do this, we used this, we mainly use this instrument right here. So this is a core, and this is a tube that's about 3 meters long. And this is a lot of weight. And we somehow, used a crane to get over the side of the ship, and then it goes straight down to the bottom of the ocean. Hopefully it fills up with sediment, and then there's a kind of gasket or a catch device on the bottom, and we can bring this tube of core back up to the boat. And once it's there, we can start interpreting it and looking at it and cataloging it. So here's my colleague looking at some smaller cores that we had taken. We can start to slice these cores into small kind of 1 centimeter increments that we measure later. And then we can in some cases cut open the core. This kind of looked like a chocolate cake. And we could start to look at the different layers. And then between understanding the different layers and something about the mineralogy of the sediments that are in these cores, we can start to understand if processes have changed, if erosion is increased or decreased, if the location where erosion is occurring possibly changed. And so this is the idea. So that's what we did on the boat. And we did this for quite a while. I think 5 weeks. I think we end up collecting something like 33 meters of gravity core, which is quite a lot. And when you say that number out loud, it becomes clear how much work remains to process this and make sense of this. But once these cores are processed, we need to start dating the core. So the idea with dating is we can use something like carbon 14 or other dating methods, and we are going to develop a relationship between the depth in the model and the year, so we can understand how what age a specific part of the core represents. And then we are also going to, in quite a detailed manner, describe the core. And here is just something I took from a colleague's paper. And we can see, we can photograph the core. We can start to describe the sizes of the sediment. Is this like a mud, or is this like a sand that you find at the beach? We can start to look at the sedimentation rate. Is this a lot of sediment being deposited in this spot or not? And we can start to make sense of this and start to see what kind of story it tells and what it says about the landscape in this region. So this was a big trip to me. So I've worked a fair bit in Switzerland, and when I left, I somehow had this anticipation that we might see some things like this in the Arctic, and that we would, and that, this was something really appealing, and also that there would be a lot of icebergs and a lot of ice, but it's hard to know how much the landform and the islands that are in this region play. So this was really a great trip to start to understand the role that these glaciers play and what kind of changes may be occurring. So lots of work remains to be done, and it seems like we really only scratched the surface on this trip, but also any slightest bit of data is really a valuable thing when we come to studying these processes. The last thing I want to do is thank a lot of people. This was a huge undertaking, and a lot of people worked very, very hard, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. These are scientists and crew members on the academic Tereshnikov. This is our boat. And then also in this kind of geology group, there's some other people listed here who really instrumental in making this a possibility. So I hope you find this interesting, and many thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Ian, for a really interesting and excellent presentation. I open the floor for questions from the audience. Please just go ahead, either type something in the chat, or you can just go ahead and open your mic and go ahead with the question.
Hello.
Yes, please go ahead, Mathilde.
Okay. Just I have a question about the sediment curing. How can you be sure that all the sediment are mostly eroded in that area and that not some sediments are transported with a certain variability through time? I don't know about which processes, but can.
Yes, that's a really good question, and that's hopefully something we can deal with nicely in the future. So the long story short is we don't know what is in our sediment cores. The other side of it is that we can see from looking at glacier velocities that some of these areas, it seems like the glacier velocity and where the erosion is occurring is in quite a localized spot. And so we would hope that we can that our sediment cores may capture this area well, and then also there are features that are really representative. Maybe we can look at other parameters. If there's a change in mineralogy, if there's a change in different characteristics in the core, maybe we can start to pull apart what exact processes are occurring. But that's a very legitimate question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Nicholas has a question, so please go ahead, Nicholas.
Thank you, Ian, for this very interesting presentation. It's the first time that I'm aware of that science, and it's really great. You started saying that some of the processes are very similar between what you see in the Swiss Alps and what you saw on your expeditions. Can you expand a little bit on this, on what is similar and maybe what wouldn't be, and then what couldn't be extrapolated to the Swiss Alps?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So when I consider glacier erosion anywhere, in both the Arctic and the Alps, I consider there's kind of two processes at work, and one is kind of how you create and grind up the sediment, and then the other is how it's transported by water. And for me, this is how I think about glacier erosion. And so in the Arctic, I think there's good reason to believe that in certain locations, there's quite a bit of sliding and quite a bit of erosion by this means. But at the same time, these glaciers are very cold, so I'm not sure how much water is reaching the bed. There could be some. And so maybe the way we think about this needs to change a little bit. So looking at parameters such as the velocities can start to be like a first step, but maybe we also need to consider slightly different mechanisms for how it's transported, or maybe, so things like that. So that's the analogy. It's these kind of physical general processes that we've learned about in the Alps, and then we can kind of take apart which ones matter and which ones maybe don't. That would be a really wonderful thing. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the audience? So I have a question, and maybe that will give some time for maybe any other follow-ups. So as far as I understand, this mission took place in an area in the Arctic that has been seldomly visited.
Yeah.
How much is actually known beforehand about glacier erosion in this region specific? Is this really the first time you have data on this effectively, or?
As far as I'm aware of, yes. There's been quite a bit of work to date the condition of the glaciers. For instance, at this point in time, the glacier was at this spot. At this point in time, the glacier was this spot. So there is some background information about the condition of the glacier. But from what I'm aware of, there's really, I don't think that there's very much in terms of like how the glaciers are shaping the landscape. So, I mean, this is somehow very nice because we have a record of what the past condition of the glacier was as a starting point. So that's another ingredient to help us understand. But I would also say that, yeah, to me, it's quite new. Yeah.
Excellent. So pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And the heterogeneity you mentioned, this is quite large. So how difficult it is to get a bigger picture of things based on these few point measurements you've taken, or have you really addressed sort of the hotspots, quote unquote, of erosion?
Well, I mean, so as I mentioned, there's something like 55 people on this ship, each with their strong desires, and so balancing your program with theirs is a art, no doubt about it. So yeah, I feel fortunate we identified a few hotspots. Unfortunately, some instrumentation that would help us like get a better idea of the spatial distribution of these processes wasn't available on the expedition. So these are really kind of more point measurements, but I think that could still be quite interesting in the sense that maybe you're not looking at the actual volume of sediment, but you're looking at a change, which is still that's still a really great place to start.
First of all, thanks a lot for giving me the chance to present and contribute to this seminar series. And as mentioned before, I work on trace element cycling in the atmosphere and will give a brief overview and kind of the implication for nutrition and health. And first of all, I want to acknowledge all the people that work on this project that were also involved in the Arctic Century expedition. Of course, Iris Thurnherr, who was also a participant, and the group members of the Inorganic Environmental Geochemistry at Eawag and ETH, and the Atmospheric Dynamics group of Heini Wernli. And as Ian already gave us a great overview of the expedition, I also wanted to give a brief introduction of the atmospheric team. And the atmospheric team, we took not only samples that we will now analyze in the lab, but also did a lot of online measurements. And we did most of these analysis and sampling on two main locations on the ship, on Monkey Island. This is above the bridge. Here on the left, you can also see a picture with different samplers to collect cloud water, also low and high volume samplers to collect filter samples, aerosols. The second location was on the second deck, special equipped atmospheric container, where most of the online measurements were done. And to just give you a brief introduction, I want to give you an overview on the different research questions that the atmospheric team was and is working on. Those did not only concern the atmosphere, but also a lot of sea-air exchange reactions. For example, the group concerning sea spray with Manuel Dalosto from Barcelona, Julia Schmale, and of course Thanos Nines from EPFL, who also of course works on aerosol properties. Zamin Kanji is focused on ice nuclei, aerosol and cloud impacts. And last but not least, our project, the sub-project of the atmospheric team, working on dynamics of atmospheric water and trace element cycles. And today I just want to give you an overview on the motivation why we are interested in trace element cycle in the atmosphere. I want to start with a picture of the periodic table. And what's special about this one here is that it highlights essential elements in bulk elements in yellow and in green trace elements that are essential for bacteria, plants, and animals. In red are trace elements that are only essential for really specific species or generally considered toxic. And the research, my main focus of research deals with three elements. selenium, arsenic, and sulfur. But today I'm mostly going to talk about selenium and sulfur. And in terms of nutrition, there's a general distinction being made that essential elements either affect crop production or nutrient supply. And for sulfur, this is an essential element for plants, so they're needed for growth. That's why it affects crop production. It didn't always used to be known as a limiting nutrient. I'm sure you're all familiar with environmental challenges like acid rain, but since the 1980s, where clean acts have been implemented, there's in the last few years an increased demand for sulfur fertilizers for agricultural soils. In contrast, selenium is actually not essential, or it is not known to be essential for plants, but it is for humans and livestock or animals. So we really rely on having this supplied to us to our nutrition, to our diet, which we mostly get from cereals, also meat. And what's also special about selenium, that there's only a very narrow concentration range that is actually considered healthy. Above concentrations are considered toxic and below deficient or too low intakes for our nutrition. And actually up to 1 billion people are affected by this globally. This doesn't only include selenium, micronutrient deficiency, for example, of iodine, zinc, but also a lot of vitamins, affects up to 2 billion people globally, which mostly concerns the global south. So this has really a global health relevance. And the question that we always want to answer in our research is, where are these trace elements or these essential elements coming from, and how they're distributed in the environment? And one very important source of these elements to surface environments is not the only one, but it's very important, is the atmosphere. And what you can see here is a broad overview of the cycles of selenium and sulfur. And I want to draw your attention to the different sources that emit these elements to the atmosphere, like industrial emissions, anthropogenic emissions from coal combustion, for example, natural emissions like volcanoes, and biogenic emissions. This includes both emissions from the terrestrial environment, like from plants or trees, but also oceans, which includes, for example, the uptake by microorganisms or phytoplankton, and then the emission into the atmosphere, what we call volatilization. And all these different sources emit different species that are then readily oxidized and taken up by the particulate phase, by aerosols. From there, they're further transported, but the final fate is mostly wet deposition, where it is introduced to surface environments and can be taken up by food chains. And what I want to highlight is, although their sources are very similar, the specific contribution of these elements differs. So biogenic sources for selenium have a higher importance compared to sulfur, and the opposite is true, that sulfur, an estimated amount of 50%, comes from industrial emissions. But it's actually not only important how much of an element is deposited on surface environments, but also, so the total concentration, but also in which form, in which chemical form, what we call speciation of elements. Because depending on their speciation, they behave very differently. For example, if they're mobilized through sorption to mineral particles, or how easily they're taken up by plants, what we call bioavailable to plants. And here on the left, you can see a simplified overview of this plant uptake mechanism. So we have the supply through different sources, atmospheric deposition, but this could also be fertilization that supply these elements in specific species that are then, depending on the speciation, readily taken up. For selenium, the most bioavailable form is selenate, which is actually quite similar to the sulfur species sulfate. And due to their chemical similarities, they're also taken up by the same uptake mechanism. They actually compete for uptake by plants. And the question that we want to answer is, which species do we find in atmospheric deposition? Because then we can predict how bioavailable, how they affect nutrition, and which factors control the speciation in atmospheric deposition. So for example, different sources, but also reactions that occur in the atmosphere. And we look at this variability in sources and speciation by sampling multiple phases, rain, cloud, and aerosol at high time resolution, just to be able to elucidate different factors, sources in between samples. And we determined the chemical speciation as I mentioned, of selenium, sulfur, and arsenic, and combine this with other chemical parameters that are usually used for source proxies, for example, sea salt or mineral dust. And most of our methods are based on mass spectrometry. Here on the bottom, you can see the speciation setup, which entails liquid chromatography, so the separation of the different species coupled to mass spectrometry, HPLC, ICP, MS. And through different method development and optimization, we're now able to reach sub-nanogram per liter ranges, or if you talk about water, is parts per trillion. And just to give you an example what that actually means, it is equivalent to one single droplet of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So it's quite low concentrations that we're now able to reach. And we applied these in different field campaigns. The first one that I want to mention was the campaign in 2019, where I spent 2 months on Pic du Midi. This is in the French Pyrenees. And it's a quite unique site because you're both exposed to Atlantic air masses coming from, marine air masses coming from the Atlantic and the Med Sea, but also continental air masses. And why the high altitude? Because at this altitude, you're mostly exposed to the free troposphere, which enables you to really look at long-range transport, not only local cycling, which would be the case if you just, for example, sample in Zürich. And what's quite unique, we combine this information with very, very detailed meteorological characterization of the atmospheric water cycle to be able to look into how these trace element cycles are connected to the atmospheric water cycles by looking, for example, where the air masses that reach our sampling location, where they're coming from, and the moisture that we then finally collect with our rainfall or our precipitation, where it is coming from. This is the expertise really of the atmospheric dynamics group of Professor Heini Vanley. And with this data set, we were able to show that marine sources, specifically coming from the Atlantic and the Bay of Biscay, were associated with higher depositions of bioavailable selenium. So the species that I mentioned earlier, selenate and other organic selenium species. And of course, the second expedition that we went on this summer, the Arctic Century expedition, where we sampled aerosols, we went super lucky with rainfall during the expedition, but also took a lot of seawater samples. And in combination with, again, our atmospheric water cycle characterization, we hope to get further insights into the marine biogenic emissions and the link to the atmospheric water cycle. And the difference to the previous field campaign site is that in quite a relatively short amount of time, we're able to cover a quite heterogeneous mixture of sources throughout the ship's track. Not only including marine emissions, but also influences from the continent, from biomass burning, for example, or other signals from biogas emissions. But to come back to this overarching questions of the seminar, how climate change will impact these different trace element cycles, I want to briefly present a study that was recently published from our group that looked at changes of atmospheric deposition over agricultural soils in the future. And this is based on a aerosol chemistry climate model and looked at 2 different socioeconomic scenarios that probably a lot of you are familiar with. So the first scenario that was looked at was SSP 2.6, where sustainably driven development maintains global warming below 2 degrees, and the other, the 8.5 scenario, where fossil fuel driven development leads to warming of about 5 degrees. And here on the plot, you can see the changes in selenium deposition under the first scenario, the 2.6 scenario. And what I want to highlight, what you can see here at the size of these pie charts, that if you compare the end of the 21st century to recent changes, there's a significant decline in atmospheric deposition of selenium. The size of the pie charts are relative to their deposition amounts, which is for selenium globally 31%. And the projected decreases are particularly noteworthy in the Northern Hemisphere. This is due to that in these continents, North America, Asia, Europe, anthropogenic emissions are quite prevalent. And what I also want to highlight is that in other certain areas, there's actually projected increases, like in the Eastern Pacific or the Southern Ocean, which are related to projected changes in precipitation patterns, but also sea ice decline, which is believed to lead to increased marine biogenic emissions. But what I also want to highlight is, if you look at the changes by the end of the 21st century, there's an overall shift to biogenic and volcanic sources to become a major contributor for selenium, from 50 to almost 100% if you look at the change from the left to the right. But really, what does that mean for anthropogenic, for agricultural soils? Here are two plots for the two scenarios for selenium and sulfur. And what I want to highlight is, again, for the Northern Hemisphere, North America, Europe, and Asia, there are strong decreases by the end of the century compared to recent changes. For sulfur, up to 90%, and selenium up to 80%. In contrast, Africa, South America, and Australia have much more modest decreases due to their less importance of anthropogenic emissions nowadays. But now the question is really, what does that mean for a global cycle of these trace elements? Because in the future, there will be also an increase or a higher demand for crop production due to satisfy rising in food demand, right? And so this really needs to be addressed, how we deal with these future projected decreases in atmospheric deposition of essential elements. But what I really want to emphasize in my outlook is that the future reduction of anthropogenic emissions are absolutely crucial to mitigate climate change and health of ecosystems and humans, but they also have negative side effects that can impact different cycles that we then need to understand and in a timely manner also address, which is really an issue that needs to be addressed by various research fields, which needs to include an expansion of the monitoring of trace elements in different environmental compartments. So not only the atmosphere, but also soil and surface water systems, because there's really a lack of study that looks at really a mass balance between the exchange of these different compartments and how climate change will impact these. There's a need for strategies for sustainable supply or resupply of nutrients to agricultural soils, because it can't be the solution that we just use more fertilizers, because this will also have strong effects on subsequent ecosystems, like increased losses to surface waters, which pose risks for aquatic organisms if they are introduced in toxic levels. And a last point that I want to mention, which maybe concerns more the research of our group, is how climate change will impact biogenic emissions, because these are usually, especially for selenium and arsenic, not well studied, especially how they will respond to changes in environmental parameters. So with this, I want to finish my presentation and with a few impressions of the Arctic Century expedition, and of course, all the participants that contributed to this great expedition. Thank you.